This week in class, we shift gears from fiction and poetry and steer into a new genre, nonfiction reportage. We'll do this through Valeria Luiselli's book, Tell Me How It Ends, and kind of rethink the roles of narrative and argument within writing. One of the interesting things about this book is that it's subtitled An Essay in 40 Questions. So it's going to kind of engage your sense of what an essay is in the end. You know, is it more about argument or a narrative? The personal context of Luiselli's work is critical to understanding it here. As she writes on page 35, I started working as an interpreter in the New York Immigration Court in March 2015. Here she's taking the stories of children who can't speak English, children who've been detained at the U.S.-Mexican border, and she has to gather their stories through the immigration department's questionnaire, which is set up in a series of 40 questions. And she starts to become frustrated with how do you understand a child's story in those 40 questions? How do you take in the story of a child's journey through them? And so she starts to see the form itself as labyrinthine as the court building structure in the end. Some basic elements for understanding the work here include understanding it first as a work of personal journalism, to use a phrase from the nonfiction writer Vivian Gornick. In her writing, Gornick distinguishes between the situation and the story, as she calls them. The situation is the historical context or moment that the writer is responding to. In this work, it's the refugee crisis that Luiselli describes, the 102,000 children detained at the U.S.-Mexican border between summer 2014 and spring 2015. The story, though, is the thing that we might engage with more as readers, which in this work may be the writer's sense of powerlessness to deal with that situation, to understand it, and to respond to it in a meaningful human way. The sense of rage and grief and shame that Luiselli says that she experiences as she comes to understand the story of these children's journeys in her work. One of the things that's going to be in great tension here is, who controls narrative shape in the end. If you see this as an essay in 40 questions, how does this detour from your expectations of a traditional essay, something that holds an argument, a thesis, or a central claim with support and counter-argument? In what ways is this an essay? In what ways does it detour from the form there? Also, Luiselli will understand migration here as a larger phenomenon. Traditionally, in American media, we've seen it as a political problem with two sides with a solution. And so Luiselli is going to kind of trouble our sense of the causes and effects here, and look at migration as a larger issue. And she's going to extend our sense of the geographies here in terms of border and boundary. Where do you draw the line between the American West or Southwest and the Mexican North in the end? So she's going to give us more historical context for the crisis here, as well as engage her own family's sense of journey here, as her husband and children come with her to New York as she works as a writer coming from Mexico City. That autobiographical context is essential to understanding the work. As noted above, she goes to work as a volunteer interpreter in the immigration court beginning in 2015. But also her own kind of pending migratory status is significant here. As I said above, that she's trying to kind of puzzle out, how she and her family will find a sense of place in New York as she works there, and how she's going to explain that situation to her children as she goes to work as a volunteer interpreter as well. As they travel through the Southwest, she writes on the bottom of page 17, when we run out of stories to tell our children, we fall silent and look out at the unbroken line of highway, perhaps trying to put together the many pieces of the story, the unimaginable story unfolding just outside the small and protected world of our rented car. Though all of it resists a rational explanation, we talk it over and consider its many angles. We try to answer our own children's questions about the situation as best we can, but we don't do very well. How do you explain any of this to your own children? The third and fourth questions on the intake questionnaire are ones that our children too ask many times, though in their own words. With whom did you travel to this country? And did you travel with anyone you knew? All children travel with a paid coyote. Some of them travel also with siblings, cousins, and friends. Sometimes when our children fall asleep again, I look back at them and hear them breathe and wonder if they would survive in the hands of coyotes and what would happen to them if they were deposited at the U.S. border, left either on their own or in the custody of Border Patrol officers. Were they to find themselves alone crossing borders and countries, would my own children survive? And so Luiselli's role as a mother here is part of the story that's engaged, right? That she works with the children who've been detained. She thinks about her own children and tries to understand the situation here in that context as well. Also, one of the complications here is that when green cards arrive for Luiselli's family members, including her husband, her own green card is not among them, so that's an additional practical complication that's present in the story as well. She opens a wider sense of historical context and kind of explores the causes or initiating events to the migration crisis, refugee crisis of 2014 and beyond. Most children, she notes, are fleeing gang violence in their home countries in Central America, where gangs like the MS-13 and the Barrio 18 are pressing children into work within the drug trade, and so children are trying to escape that life. She also points to larger political events like the Salvadoran Civil War, a bloody fight from 1979 to 1992, where 1/5 of El Salvador's population seeks refuge in places elsewhere in the world, including the United States. She also tells the stories of of the horrors of border crossing, the kinds of violence that have arisen within that space of borderland. The 120,000 people who have disappeared since 2006, the fact that 80% of women and younger girls who have been raped as they've tried to make that journey. And she also kind of details a sense of the horrors of the solutions that have been presented here. And so during the Obama administration, to respond in a more kind of immediate way to children's situations, the priority juvenile docket was established as a means of dealing with children who'd been detained, and she details that as a solution on pages 39 and 40 that sets up its own sense of horror there. Her own sense of frustration, though, is with how human beings kind of normalize horror and violence in the midst of these things. As she writes on page 30, numbers and maps tell horror stories, but the stories of deepest horror are perhaps those for which there are no numbers, no maps, no possible accountability, no words ever written or spoken. And perhaps the only way to grant any justice, were that even possible, is by hearing and recording those stories over and over again, so that they come back always to haunt and shame us. Because being aware of what is happening in our era and choosing to do nothing about it has become unacceptable. Because we cannot allow ourselves to go on normalizing horror and violence, because we can all be held accountable if something happens under our noses and we don't dare even look. The Luiselli is kind of in making that charge of that we tend to normalize that horror and violence through the kind of traditional debate. She goes back to a sense in which narrative is the answer. That you have to go back to the stories, hear the children's stories, which are a problem to her because they have no beginning, no middle, and no end. As she begins to take them through those 40 questions. Stories are broken, as she writes on pages 41 and 42, and the question of who has control of those broken stories, who's able to put them back together in a way, who's able to shape them, becomes a significant aspect of the larger story here. Some of these, some of the things that impact the ways in which we understand these stories involves terminology. Do you use the word illegal or undocumented when you describe the status of someone who's migrated? Do you use the word immigrant or refugee in trying to understand the larger phenomenon of movement here? Also, the legal categories that that get set up in trying to pose a solution to the problem become essential to understanding the phenomenon. If someone has deportable status, or in regards to Mexican children who can who are susceptible to the policy of voluntary return, where if a border patrol agent finds a Mexican child, the Mexican child can be returned to Mexico without any due process or hearing. So in what ways does the terminology that we use here regularize or normalize that sense of horror to the story? What we end up with, according to Luiselli in the end, is the same predictable, fucked up plot as she writes on pages 51, 52, which goes more or less as follows. She writes, "Children leave their homes with a coyote. They cross Mexico in the hands of this coyote, riding La Bestia train. They try not to fall into the hands of rapists, corrupt policemen, murderous soldiers, and drug gangs who might enslave them in poppy or marijuana fields if they don't shoot them in the head and mass bury them. If something goes wrong and something happens to a child, the coyote is not held accountable. In fact, no one is ever held accountable. The children who make it all the way to the U.S. border turn themselves in to Border Patrol officers and are formally detained, often by officers who say things like, 'Speak English, now you're in America.' They are then placed in the icebox and later in a temporary shelter. There they must start looking for their parents if they have parents, or for relatives who will sponsor them. Later they are sent to wherever their sponsor lives. And finally they have to appear in court where they can defend themselves against deportation if they have a lawyer." So in the end, Luiselli is kind of dealing with the question of how story works here. How do we take in the stories of these children's journeys? How do we complicate them versus the traditional kinds of arguments that are made about immigration? Because she argues that in the end, those kind of traditional arguments lead to the situation where no one is ever held accountable. The arguments themselves become ways of normalizing the horrors of the children's journeys, and of just kind of washing them away in the end. And so the recovery of narrative is essential. Recovering the narrative of the children's journeys becomes essential here to understanding the phenomenon. It'll be interesting to get your responses to this as you kind of rethink her work as essay and story.